Well, hello everybody, and welcome. I'm Aaron Merrill of the Williston Historical Society. We're really happy to be co-sponsoring this Dangerous Characters, The Life and Crimes of Delia and Charlie Potter with the Chittenden County Historical Society. I wanted to give Carolyn Gould a moment here to speak, the president.
Welcome everyone. Elizabeth is on our board, so we were happy to co-sponsor this. Plus I get to meet all of you and come to this wonderful library, which I love. I was saying to Aaron that I want to become 10 years old and sit in a circle and have somebody read me a story, you know? It's just so conducive to that, so kudos to this library. It's wonderful. I just wanted to have all of you write down August 16th and 17th. That weekend is the Fanny Allen weekend at the Ethan Allen Homestead, and we are co-sponsoring it this year because it's our 60th anniversary. And we're going to be doing a special bulletin, two in fact, one on the various crafts that went up and down Lake Champlain, and the other a sort of look back over the last 60 years. So it's going to be really special. And we're going to have all kinds of family-friendly and adult-friendly events. There'll be two talks, one on Saturday at 2 and one on Sunday at 2. So stay tuned for that. And it's going to be fun. Plus, admission to the museum is free for Vermont residents. Good. So all of the people can come, and if we have a big turnout, I'm going to try and figure out a way to do a shuttle. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but it'll happen. Anyway, so mark it on your calendars. I think it's going to be really fun, and we're going to have birthday cake. Of course. So thank you. Thanks for coming.
It's my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Allen, who's our presenter today, and following in the footsteps of her father, Richard Allen, who is a local history researcher and writer, and now you are doing the same, and has published several pieces and currently working on a book on the topic of today's presentation. So we're excited to hear your story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to Dangerous Characters, The Life and Crimes of Delia and Charlie Potter, or as I have been calling this project since I started working on it, the horrible Potters and their horrible life choices. Thanks to the Williston Historical Society, a research grant allowed me to find out what dubious activities the Potters got up to in Canada East. That's what Quebec was called back in their day. So this presentation is thanks to sponsorship from the Williston Historical Society. As we begin our story, I think of it as one of families in conflict. And I've got a family tree up here so you can kind of see some of the major players. The Potters, who I'm talking about, are Delia and Charlie, and they're in yellow. But I think to really understand the conflict that this family was involved in, we have to go back a few generations to Delia's grandparents. They're in green. They were Philip and Hannah Walker, and they had 11 kids. 2 of those kids were Sally Griswold, Sally, and then Catherine, who's in red over there. So they had those 2 daughters and then 9 other kids. Sally married Ephraim. They had 4 kids who died young. Delia's biological mom, Catherine, married Elihu Barber, but Catherine died shortly after giving birth to Delia in 1829. Delia had a slightly older sister, and when her biological mother died, her biological father gave Delia to Ephraim and Sally. So Delia's aunt and uncle took her when she was just a few weeks old to raise her. I don't know what happened to her slightly older sister. I think her slightly older sister stayed in Williston and was raised by people in Williston. But anyway, so Delia lost her biological mother when she was very young. Her father handed off care of her to the Griswolds. And then her father went as far west in New York State as you can go without actually leaving the state. He married again. He had apparently 7 children, died in Poland, New York, and apparently never came back. So with the early death of her biological mother, with the basic abandonment of her biological father, I think Delia was left with a lot of thoughts and worries about the stability of parental figures in her life, like whether people would stick around, whether she was worthy of love. And so it's part of my thesis is that we can kind of see those anxieties tracing their way throughout this story. Next. So when asked her name when she was a kid, Delia would respond with this little rhyme. She would say, "I'm Adelia Sophia Maria Barber, Ephraim Griswold's adopted daughter." And people thought that was cute, and she was pert and clever. I put this up here, though, because as you can see, she's going by the surname of her biological father, Barber. She's highlighting that she's adopted. So to me, this indicates that she might not have felt secure in the familial relationship between the Griswolds, who were basically functioning as her parents, and her relationship to them. So even though the Griswolds, Sally and Ephraim, were richer, more financially stable than Delia's biological parents, money can't buy you love. I used emojis here because I don't have pictures of any of the key players, but Sally was notorious for having a bad temper. She got physically violent with one of her farm boys once and got in a fight with him, pushed him down on the stoop. So she would often lose her temper, say outrageous things, and Delia responded by, as the emoji suggests, keeping quiet, going along with whatever Sally wanted, trying to keep the peace that way. So this tension between Sally, adoptive mother and aunt, and Delia, adoptive daughter, who's kind of uncertain about her status, continued throughout Sally's life, let's just say. Sally and Ephraim officially adopted Delia on January 27th, 1847. This was back before adoption really had an easy process in Vermont. So if you wanted to adopt someone, you had to take a petition to the legislature and say, we would like to adopt this person. So I found this record of Delia's adoption in Williston Land Records in the town clerk's office. It says, it's hereby enacted by the General Assembly of the state of Vermont that Adelia Sophia Barber, again, going by her birth surname, is hereby constituted the heir at law of the Griswolds in as full and perfect a manner as if she had been the daughter of this said Ephraim and Sally Griswold, born in lawful wedlock. So she was officially adopted right before she became an adult, and it seems to me the Griswold's way of giving her some financial security by making her their heir on, in case of their deaths, and maybe in their minds, kind of proving that they really did care about her, they really did want this legal connection. So, when she was 19, so very shortly after she was officially adopted, Delia married Charlie Potter. And I have this map up here to show some of the key locations in the Potter's world and to kind of introduce you to them. Franklin, Vermont, kind of third down, that's where Charlie was born. He was born very close to the border between Vermont and Canada East. It wasn't Quebec then, it was Canada East. His family was actually from Dunham, Canada East, which is the top point there, and that's a location that will recur in this story. Delia and Charlie married in Williston, the farthest south of these locations, and Cook's Corner, which is just over the line in Canada East, that's a location where they set up business in the 1850s. So when she was 19, Delia, started a life of her own, got out of the parental abode, and probably hoped for some, peace from Sally's abusive ways, and, hope for some independence. Now, to find out what the Potter's life was like, I was using all different types of sources. One of the ones that I was particularly interested in was the 1850 Schedule 4 agricultural census. And this gave me a glimpse of what the Potter's farm was like in 1850. So this is just after they'd married. So there were 4 people on their farm. There were Delia, Charlie, and 2 servants. It was 1,400 acres. It had a cash value of $1,500. It had 6 cows that yielded 600 pounds of butter and 20 pounds of cheese. They had 110 sheep that yielded 120 pounds of wool. They had 6 horses, 2 pigs, and 2 working oxen. I put kind of poor because I was comparing all this information to all the other people on the same page of the agricultural census. It was Brownells, it was Frenches, it was Ishams. These were much more prosperous people who had already gotten into agricultural specialization with large numbers of sheep or large numbers of cows. And so in comparison, the Potter's farm was like far below both the median and the average worth of farms in the neighborhood. So they weren't doing that well. They were just basically farming for their family, not necessarily, having that agricultural specialization to create products to sell. By contrast, however, the Griswolds, Sally and Ephraim, were doing very, very well. They ended up in El Dorado County in 1850. They caught the gold excitement, as it was called, and they joined, the greatest mass migration in the history of the U.S. at that time. And I found them in the 1850 census. Ephraim was mining on Middle Fork American River. So you can see a picture of miners at the bottom of this slide from approximately the same period when Ephraim was there. The Middle Fork American River wasn't a community, it was just the river, and they just sent a census taker to go up and down the river because there were so many miners just searching for gold there. And he was getting about $7 a day, which is pretty lucrative. Sally ran a public house, so she was serving food and drink at inflated prices to the miners who were willing to pay. Oh, also, over on the left you can see Middle Fork American River and a map of California. It's kind of in the middle of this Sierra Nevada there. She also ended up in Sacramento, which is why I put approximately 1850s shot of Sacramento on this slide. So Ephraim came back to Williston about 1854. He was quite rich himself, but Sally stayed out west, working and earning and saving and becoming richer and succeeding in a way that the Potters were not. Eventually, Sally joined Ephraim back in Williston, and they built a mansion in 1856. It had red brick, but those were only veneers. It had a second-story ballroom, Brussels carpets, mahogany furniture, massive amounts of silver plate, and this was really fascinating to people who were not even really used to door knockers. It had a front doorbell. So people thought this was the showplace of the region. They would come from far and wide. Sally would welcome people in and show off her belongings.
Can I ask a question? Where was that house located, actually?
That house is, it's on 2A. It's on
It
St.
is.
George Road. So if you get, what's the exit number?
12.
Well, you go
So
under
is
the
it-
interstate and up the hill
It is.
and past
That's what I thought. On the
Old
right.
Creamery Road.
On the right.
It's on the left
Oh, it's on
as
the
you head
left.
south.
Still there.
And pretty much,
It's still there.
pretty quickly,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's visible. It's not set back from the road.
Somebody kept saying it was around River Cove Road, and
No,
I kept
no, no, no,
thinking it
no.
was,
No.
yeah, right. Okay, thank you.
Sure. So while the Griswold, Sally and Ephraim were rolling in dough and showing off their wealth, the Potters weren't. They racked up debts that they couldn't pay, so they failed to pay their mortgage, and so in a pattern that we will see throughout their lives, they fled up to Canada East. In Dunham, where Charlie's family was from, actually, this a case of kidnapping occurred. This is a fascinating story. So there were guys from Chittenden County who had a writ to go up to Dunham and get Charlie and bring him back, extradite him, so that he could pay the debts that he left. So these, freelance pesterers went up and broke into the Potters' rooms at night and said, "Hi, we're here to arrest you and extradite you for your debts." They had a set of leg irons. They put the leg irons on Charlie because he was kind of overwhelmed by this posse of guys showing up. Delia said, "Well, I don't like this." So she ran. She got a sympathetic magistrate, brought that person back, had that person question the freelance extraditors. They realized that the freelance extraditors were lying because the freelance extraditor was like, "I am the total chief of police of the entire continent, and I have the authority to arrest you in the king's name." No, queen's name, which he didn't. So they took the leg irons off Charlie, they put him on the liar, all the would-be extraditors got arrested and cleared out, and the Potters completely escaped any sort of consequences for their actions in another pattern that we will see recurring. So it's just an example of a chancery suit against the Potters filed in Chittenden County, just giving an example of the kind of debts that they were racking up and then scooting off to Canada East to avoid. Life wasn't all, fun or narrow escapes for them while they were in Canada East. They had 4 kids, and 2 of their 4 kids died very young when they were up in Canada East. Charles Jr., 1851 to 1859. That's his stone on the left that you can see. And then Carly W., whose name suggests that he was maybe intended to be kind of a replacement for Charlie Jr. Unfortunately, he only lived 4 years and between 1859 and 1863. Now, like I said, we have no photos that I have discovered so far of these rapscallions, but the closest I have is a picture of their signatures. Charlie's is on the top, Delia's is on the bottom, and those are from Charlie Jr.'s burial record. I think it's interesting because Charlie uses a common abbreviation of the period for his first name, so CHAS. So it's CHAS Potter. But when I look at it, it seems very full of loops and curlicues, and it's almost kind of illegible. So to me, it seems like very fancy. Perhaps he's a person who likes to show off. He is a person who likes to show off. But at the same time, the illegibility makes me wonder, does he also have something to hide? Well, yes he does. In contrast, Adelia has a very controlled signature. She writes Adelia.S.Potter. And she seems to be very precise, concerned with how she appears to other people, and, probably holding back and hiding and controlling something as well. So there's my little armchair psychoanalysis based on handwriting. So along with the death of 2 of their kids and various other activities. The Potters were also murder adjacent, let's just say, up in Cook's Corner. So they had a combination post office, bar, general store, I don't know, it was a little bit of everything place up in Cook's Corner, Canada East. And one night on September 2nd, 1864, a bunch of riotously drunk men came from the race courses nearby, and there were drunken fist fights. There were people throwing bricks and glasses. There were people saying, "Catch Potter and we will kill him!" Death threats against Charlie were made. Delia's life was imperiled, at least according to her testimony later. Numerous injuries. William Driscoll, an unfortunate St. Albans customer, was murdered by an unknown assailant in this brawl. The murder weapon was Charlie's axe, but a coroner's inquest failed to discover conclusively who actually killed him. The Potters gave testimony, and of course they were just innocent, and they were trying to preserve their property. And, Delia was menaced by Driscoll, but she cleverly escaped him in her testimony. And Charlie was just telling people to calm down and, fleeing for his life when he saw the brawl got too rowdy. So even though someone had died in a drunken fracas at their business, there were apparently no consequences for the Potters in this particular case. As you might guess, Delia and Charlie had a pretty rocky partnership. This actually goes back in time to 1858, but Delia seemed to be pretty unhappy in her marriage. I know this because she filed for divorce in Chittenden County, Vermont. In 1858, she alleged that Charlie had abandoned her. And then also, yes, that he had committed adultery on diverse occasions. But it's interesting that she mentioned abandonment first, as it to me that, maybe that goes back to her earlier worries about security and familial attachments. So in her divorce petition, she very carefully, in several paragraphs, enumerated all the assets that she had and how she wanted them all back when she got divorced. She was very concerned with her financial security, I think because she equated that to emotional security. And the two surviving Potter kids, only two at this time, Katie and Willis, just got less than a sentence, less than a paragraph saying that she should have custody of them because of their tender years. So it seemed to me that she was much more concerned about her assets and her financial security than the kids. So bringing back the family tree, because we're around about spring 1865 now. Civil War is ending, and Potters, in yellow, with the kids who either died or aren't alive yet, blacked out, so don't pay attention to them. So the Potters, in yellow, left Canada East. You know why? Because they racked up debts they couldn't pay. So they left Canada East, and they went back. Where'd they go back to? Williston, where they had originally racked up debts they couldn't pay. Great idea. Katie and Willis were their only kids at this time. So not only that, but they moved in with Sally and Ephraim Griswold. So the struggling, legally dubious, raucous, pro-drinking couple moved in with the people who had become, wealthy and proud of themselves after, gaining money in the gold rush. And in this case, Delia was supposed to manage the household. So even though the Griswolds had this amazing mansion, they still farmed. So Delia was supposed to manage the amazing mansion, I guess, and Charlie was supposed to manage the farm. See how that turned out. This is how it turned out. But conflict centered around Delia and Sally, and everyone in the neighborhood heard about it. So Sally wanted to run the household like she always had, because She was a leader, and she was used to that. Delia tried to comply with Sally's increasingly frustrated and combative manner. She tried to do everything she could to please Sally, and again, the zipper is to indicate that she did so quietly. But tension still remained because Delia was no longer a kid who would just submit. She was a wife now. She had coped with this guy, survived a riot, thought cleverly getting this guy out of leg irons. And so I feel like she probably wanted some more respect, treatment as an equal. But Sally was loath to give it. Ephraim was busy downplaying and ignoring the conflict, I think. Hence his representation with eyes covered. And Charlie was also getting into conflict with Sally. He really did not like her. He's saying, I'll pay money to get rid of the old lady, because he made lots of sarcastic remarks about how he didn't like her and basically how he would pay money to get rid of her. Chauncey Brownell and other neighbors of both the Potters and the Griswolds watched with increasing worry as this conflict brewed. And the two surviving, two kids, Katie and Willis, lived in this atmosphere full of conflict where violence was never far away. So that's why they looked miserable, because they probably were. The conflict between the Potters and the Griswolds came to a head on Sunday, August 27th, 1865. Most of the household headed for Canada East. But Sally and the farm boy, this was the 13-year-old kid that she had beaten up once, were left in the mansion. So the next day, a neighbor noticed that Sally, who was a habitual early riser, was not up yet. So he went over and went looking for her. He found that the farm boy had been locked in his room upstairs, and downstairs there was blood. Blood stains were all over the first floor. So letting Edward call out of his bedroom, the neighbor and the farm boy went looking for Sally, and they found her body in the calf pen. She had her apron pulled up over her face, and she had clearly been murdered after a protracted struggle. So here's a photo of her gravestone. This is in East Cemetery in Williston, and it says Sally Walker, wife of Ephraim Griswold, massacred on the night of the 27th of August, 1865. Now, before we get into the story of the murder trial, etc., I just want to take some time to talk about the historical moment, and by the historical moment, I mean from maybe 1845 to 1875, when most of the events in this story occur. I feel like at this time, Williston was experiencing the growing pangs of modernity. For example, temperance was increasingly popular as a form of, social purity, public health activism. Vermont had passed its own prohibition law in 1852, inspired by Maine's 1851 law. And then in 1863, closer to the time we're talking about, Williston formed its own Maine Law League, and the people in this league went around trying to get temperance pledges from other people, or harassing liquor salespersons and making sure that they followed the rules. And so I bring this up because the Potters were not teetotalers. They ran a bar. They were associated with, a murder that had resulted because of drunken fistfights, and eventually they got into bootlegging too. So they were very invested in alcohol. And I feel like, they were not on the pro-temperance side of things. Another thing that I think is important to consider in this story is railroads and out-migration. And I put those together because they facilitate each other. Of course, the Central Vermont Railroad came to North Williston in 1849, and this was a great source of pride to the town. At the same time, though, Vermont's farms seemed small and expensive, And they did not seem to compare to the seemingly empty, seemingly cheap land out west, which had been forcibly depopulated of many Native Americans by the railroad companies and the federal government. So the lure of this land out west drew people from Vermont, New England, northern New York, out there, as well as gold, silver, and other resources that were being found out west. And, you know, the Griswolds embody this lure of the West. Although they did come back, they did do very well for themselves. And the Potters, I think, embody people who stayed and could not afford to travel, and then, you know, looked on with envy as the Griswolds made money. Finally, the Civil War. It's something that Delia and Charlie pretty much avoided because they were up in Canada East at the time, but I think it's important to bring up because the conflict was portrayed as universally supported. In 1865, when Sally was murdered, it was right after the Civil War, so people were gathering together, you know, mourning the loss of Lincoln, but also like creating this narrative that everybody in the North had supported the conflict and that everybody had, you know, gotten behind the noble soldiers who had sacrificed, but not everybody did. There was actually quite a variety of ambivalent feelings about the draft and the Civil War in the North, and I think Charlie epitomizes that because, like I said, the Potters spent the entire Civil War up in Canada East, except Charlie came back in person on December 15th, 1863, to sign up for the 1st Vermont Cavalry in Williston. He collected a bounty of $300, but he did not report to the draft, like the local draft board. So he signed up, got money, and left the actual fighting to someone else. He was not the only person, though, who evaded service. There were 90,000 skedaddlers, as they were called, who usually living in border states close to Canada, who went over the border to avoid the reach of the U.S. law. And there were 4 drafts between 1863 and 1865, and like the majority of people who were eligible did not sign up. So there were more people who tried to exempt themselves or run away or avoid service than who actually signed up. So I think that's it's important to bring that up to show that this was not as unanimously supported a conflict as, you know, I think we like to think or read about in our history books. And also, to go back to the kind of growing pains idea, you know, progress doesn't just march along in one direction with everybody marching happily along after it. You know, Charlie and Delia were like, all right, we should probably avoid this war, right? Charlie's like, yeah, except for I can get $300 if I go down to Williston, where we're persona non grata, but that's okay. So there are complex factors bubbling around here. All right, back to Sally's murder. So there were 2 guys arrested for Sally's murder. One was Charlie, the other was this guy. His name was either John Ward or Jerome Levine. We don't know much about him, except for that he was a freelance kind of henchman for hire that Charlie connected to through a counterfeiter he knew. Yeah, Charlie was involved in counterfeiting too. So the prosecution argued that Charlie had hired Ward, this guy, and Ward had actually killed Sally. Circumstantial evidence strongly pointed to Ward. I'm not going to get into that because that could be a whole other presentation. So, while there wasn't much of a connection to show that Ward and Charlie had really planned anything in advance, Ward was found guilty Charlie was acquitted. Ward went to state prison. He was there in solitary confinement for about a year. He was executed March 20th, 1868. Meanwhile, the Potters and the Griswolds were maintaining status quo. And what I mean by that is, even though that one of the members of the extended family was acquitted and the other one had been violently murdered, they were still living in the Griswold house. Ephraim was actually sleeping in Sally's old bedroom where she had been murdered. It was kind of an illustration to me that the Potters were really interested in claiming that house for theirs. Like, they didn't move out of the house because they seemed to be interested in the house and the status that the wealth represented, the social acclaim that it represented. So that's what the status quo says to me. Let's switch for a moment to a more likable character, Smith Wright. He's rich, he's popular, he's a teetotaler, very active in temperance societies. He's everything the Potters aren't. He also owns a general store in Williston Village, Williston Four Corners, lives across from it, and on June 14th, 1868, there was a burglary at his store. Over $1,000 of cotton, clothes, shoes, and goods were abstracted. The rogues were tracked a distance of 2 miles north of the village, but further there was no trace of them. Who could it have been? Well, let me tell you about those traces. Distinctive wagon tracks from a wagon known to be owned by the Potters led to the Griswold house. A search of the property revealed tools and the stolen goods under the floor, and Delia was acting very suspicious about this. Charlie, guess what he was doing? He was hiding out in Canada East, because that's what he always does when anything occurs. So he was hiding out when the robbery occurred. He was up in Canada. However, Delia and Charlie were ultimately locked up for possessing burglars' tools. And I should say that the law had a heck of a time keeping them locked up for something. But they were locked up ultimately on this charge, and that was what they went to trial for. At the trial, Stephen Foster, an ex-friend of the Potters, spilled the beans. He said Charlie planned the robbery and then went off to Canada East. He said that Stephen Foster said that he and Delia had actually done the robbery. So yet again, Delia's doing the dirty work, and Charlie's, hanging out with his relatives up there. And so after this copious circumstantial testimony from Foster, the judge cautioned the jury not to be swayed by sentiment about the Potters. Translation, everybody hated them, wanted them put away for something. He said, they're only on trial here for possessing burglars' tools. This is what you're supposed to decide. Well, everybody in Vermont and everybody on the jury was apparently really sick of the Potters getting away with things. So after 10 minutes, they were both given a guilty verdict. So then they went to local jail, county jail, to await sentencing. As they were doing so, Ward's confession came out. So this was published after his death. It was published in spring 1869 when the Potters were awaiting their sentences. And he made some really silly claims. He said, it wasn't me who killed Sally. It was someone who looked like me, which is why I put his evil twin. He also said that Ephraim had gotten in on the plans to kill Sally because he disliked her as much as Charlie did. We have no proof of that. So that's an open question, what Ephraim's feelings were towards Sally. So while he made some silly claims, Ward also made some serious and believable claims. He said Charlie hired him. He said Delia knew everything and kept silent, and gave her support that way. And as you can see, the title of his confession is The Victimized Assassin. And this title comes because he spends a lot of time in his confession saying that the Potters were liars. They promised that they would give him money so he could bribe people so he could escape, and they never did. Interestingly, there was lots of correspondence from Ward to other people. Like, he was begging for help. He was also writing to the Potters begging for help. So his correspondence was confiscated. It was also published as part of this confession, and it pretty much backed up this last claim that the Potters promised but didn't deliver. And so in this, after this confession came out, I think it turned public opinion even further against the Potters. So when they were sentenced, Charlie got 10 years in prison and Delia got 7.
And that's for burglary tools.
That's for possessing burglars' tools. So they went down to Vermont State Prison in Windsor. It was an overcrowded and miserable place when Delia and Charlie arrived. There were micromanaging rules, like you had to be quiet all the time, you had to march in formations. People had to do manual labor. The men made either scythe handles or they made shoes. The women sewed, repaired men's clothes, knitted stockings. It was also an unclean and kind of disease-ridden place. And I put regular humiliation because the newspapers like to chronicle tours of 100 children and teachers and other people connected with a Sunday school, because, touring prison is a great educational endeavor for a Sabbath school. So these people are walking through the prison quietly without talking, so they're following the rules of poor prisoners, and which was very gratifying to the officers of the prison. But how do you think the prisoners felt being gawked at? They didn't like it. John Ward actually wrote in his confession, why do they stare at me as if I'm a beast? I'm a man no less than they are, even though I'm behind bars. Delia was pregnant when she went to prison. She gave birth to her last kid, Helen Louisa, on May 2nd, 1870. She probably gave birth in the prison, immediately after which the child was taken away, almost certainly to Williston, to be raised by relatives. So after the heartbreak of, giving birth to the child but not being able to really hang on to her, Delia then had the heartbreak of learning that the child died young in August 1870. Conditions in the women's quarters continued to be dark and dank and oppressive, and Delia died on December 18th, 1872 in prison. She died of typhus, but this was also called jail fever at the time because it was really conduced by unsanitary conditions that would let this, I think it was a bacterium, generate in louse feces and, become aspirin and other disgusting things. So she was 42 years old when she died. She was buried in Eldridge Cemetery, which is right by the airport in South Burlington. And you can see that she's commemorated on her stone, and also an infant daughter. So she's together with Helen Louisa. That's almost certainly Helen Louisa. Charlie had it slightly better. He was pardoned near the end of his sentence in 1877, but as the Rutland Daily Globe headline indicates, he was really unwelcome in Vermont, and people at this point had basically assumed that the Potters had killed Sally, even though he was not imprisoned for murder. The Rutland Globe writers really didn't like him. And wisely sensing the animosity against him, Charlie did something smart for once in his life. He headed out of Vermont, went to Chicago to live near his mom, his siblings. He married a second time, a woman about whom I know nothing except her first name. He worked in meat packing for about 2 years, so this was demanding, grueling labor, repetitive, with unsafe conditions, and he was already kind of frail after having been in jail for a while. So he died on January 29th, 1882, age 54, complications from gallstones. probably also having been run down by meatpacking work. He's buried next to Delia in Eldridge Cemetery, South Burlington. That's his stone. It has fallen off. It's pediment and nobody has picked it up. Interestingly, he is noted on his stone as C. Hannibal Potter, and some people speculate that that might be just a way to slightly disguise his name because he was very infamous at the time. Here comes another emoji. So now that I've talked to you about the story of the Potters, why do we care? Why am I telling you? Well, I have a few reasons. I mean, usually people who get to know about the Potters and the Griswolds do so through the 1865 killing of Sally. And then retellings of that story focus on Sally, who is this, kind of iconoclastic, entrepreneurial, go-getting person, or Charlie, who's like the good-for-nothing, two-timing scamp, or Ward, who's the kind of credulous, victimized assassin. So you've got those three colorful characters that usually show up in retellings, but not Delia. But like I said, this is about intrafamilial conflict. Like, the Griswolds who were able to go out west, were able to get rich, were able to have financial security, and the Potters who stayed and did not have that financial security and really envied the Griswolds. And Delia is at the center of this story. I mean, without her, none of this would have happened, really. So I think that, part of my reason for telling the story was to try to tell her story, because she kind of ties everything together, as far as I'm concerned. Another thing is that this story is about Williston at a pivotal time. Like I said, Williston was suffering kind of the growing pangs of modernity. On one hand, you had like pro-temperance people who are like, yeah, we're going to clean up this town, and our teetotalism makes Williston so moral and virtuous. And on the other hand, you had bootleggers and bartenders like the Potters who are like, but we make money this way, and people like to drink, and we like to drink. So the tension between these beliefs in temperance met up with the reality of people liking alcohol. At the same time, out-migration was a huge concern for people in Vermont. Seeing why they were asking themselves, like, why does the lure of the West seem so strong? Why are all the good people leaving? And the Griswold who left but also came back, and the Potters kind of illustrate two possibilities of out-migration. Out-migration was for people who could afford it, and or people who were desperate enough to leave. And staying was for maybe people who couldn't afford it, who didn't really have that choice. And then finally, the perspective on the Civil War. Like, instead of it being a conflict that united everyone in the North, the Potters' absence throughout the Civil War and Charlie's almost certain coming down for the bounty but not actually serving, I think shows a more kind of nuanced, ambivalent, complex range of responses to this conflict. So I care because it's a really interesting story, and also because I think that the Potters and the Griswolds elucidate, like in microcosm, some of the tumultuous trends that were affecting Williston at this time. And to read their story is to read about, in some sense, or to think about how Williston and how Vermont were modernizing at the time. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. I'm going to go back to the family tree if anyone has questions.
Where was the Potter's Farm located?
They're-
When they were in Williston.
Yeah, they were in Williston. They were actually located pretty much across the street from the Griswold house. So that was where the house that they bought in 1850 was located. So they were right across the street from that mansion that they could look at. You know.
Because there's an old house right across from where the Bells lived. Was that their home, do you think, or was it different?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's behind a hedge. It's,
Right,
it's
right.
not
I
visible.
have not gone behind the hedge yet because I don't want to like wander in with my parents.
But I would guess that might be it, because that's old houses on the road.
Yeah, but thank you for that question. Yes.
Questions. What happened to the divorce idea? And then also what happened to all the California wealth of the Griswolds?
What happened with the divorce idea? That's a good question. You know, Delia had that petition in 1858, but she did not follow through. That she remained married to Charlie for the rest of her life. And my theory is that, you know, maybe she was too intimidated by him to go through with divorce because he was a very quick-tempered person, manipulative, you know, person who killed someone's horses because that person had him arrested for a murder. So he was vengeful. So, you know, she might have been intimidated by him. Additionally, she might have thought, well, I married him. I kind of have to live with it. I threw my lot with him. In with him, I'm going to be loyal. So who knows what happened to the divorce petition. In terms of the Griswold's wealth, well, Ephraim was still alive, obviously, after Sally was murdered. He continued to live in the house until he died in, I think, mid-1880s. Then he left the house to a relation, I think. But it seems to kind of dwindled and died with him.
Do you know if the Griswolds that are here in Vermont today were related?
I
You know,
do not.
Like the cement.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I don't.
because that's kind of an unusual name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just an observation, not so much a question, is have you considered that Ephraim might have paid for those 2 stones in the Eldridge Cemetery? Because it strikes me that if you're in prison or a meat packer, you probably wouldn't have had money for those.
Yeah, he's probably the person who paid for the stones. I mean, he's definitely the person who paid to have Sally Walker, wife of Ephraim Griswold, massacred on the night of August 27, 1865, written. So he was, weirdly enough, like one of the oldest and like the only surviving people of this clan. Right. So yeah, he probably invested in those stones and probably made sure they were way over there.
Right, and somebody had to have claimed her body to bring her back up to Windsor, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I suppose otherwise there's a graveyard at the prison where
Right.
I imagine there's unidentified burials there.
Potter's Field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm speculating here. It seems like Ephraim liked the Potters because you wouldn't continue to live with these people after they like hacked your wife. Like,
I am not really sure what his relationship with Charlie and Delia was. It's kind of difficult to tell from testimony. To me, he seems to be downplaying conflict between Sally, his wife, and Delia. So who knows?
Maybe he conspired with them, maybe he didn't like his own wife.
That is what John Ward, the assassin, the victimized assassin, said. I don't have any proof of that, but that was Ward's
Well,
point.
even if he didn't conspire, it could be that they just did him a favor.
I would venture to say that a lot of people in the late 19th century tried to maintain a sense of decorum even in the midst of really, really horrible circumstances. That they would make a burial plot and a tombstone to show that he wasn't making a judgment. You know, there is so much show involved, and if you look at some of the actual tales of some of the people involved, I don't care where you are in the United States, there is a tremendous amount of posturing in what is being presented. So it's really, really hard to find out what you've uncovered about any of this, because it's often glossed over, or the opposite is true. You read these completely melodramatic, bloodthirsty accounts. You know, they tend to split apart into the horrible tales or these wonderful people who were massacred. You know, so it's very, very difficult to get at some kind of truth.
Yeah.
I was wondering, kind of going back to a question that was asked earlier, in your research, did you encounter any people alive now who had a connection to these families or to this story? And if so, how did they relate to it?
I have read about people who have, lived in the house, that sort of thing, but I have not talked to any. I have not talked to like the current owners of the house, which is why you don't see any like current pictures of the house. So that's next on my list.
I was gonna, my introduction to this history was about 20 years ago. I forget the name of the woman who lived in the house, but had lots of stories of Sally's ghost. And I actually brought students to her house, and she gave us a tour, and the kids were very hooked by that as well. So I was wondering what
Sally's ghost is another aspect of the story.
And I was wondering what hooked you into it.
Oh, well, I got into this story not through Sally's murder at all, but because I was trying to find out about Oliver Barber, who was Delia's grandfather, and he kept posting ads in the Burlington papers like, "This male relative has run away and I'm not responsible for his death." And I'm like, why do people keep running away from this person's house? So then I started trying to find out about Oliver Barber's kids, one of whom was Elihu Barber. Couldn't find anything about Elihu Barber after, like, I don't know, 1827, because that's when he went over to New York. So I started tracing Delia, and then I was like, why is Delia's adoption by these Griswold people coming up as evidence in a murder trial? How is Delia Barber related to the Griswolds? So that's how I came to the story. I was doing research for the Past Times column for the Williston Observer, and ended up writing 4 articles about Potters. But I came onto them thinking that I was originally going to write about Oliver Barber and all the people who ran away from his house. But let's see where that happened.
So the Barber Farm Road, is that where their farm was? You know, the one right by 117 River
Yeah,
Road.
well, that's in
That area.
Jericho.
Oh, that's Jericho.
The Barbers were.
Yes, but maybe they were relatives.
Maybe it's like.
Might have been.
Barbers are very common.
Sure.
Do we know why Charlie was pardoned?
He was pardoned because, according to the story and according to newspaper articles, the assistant judge, a whole bunch of jury members, and eminent Willisstonians got together and advocated to the governor that he should be pardoned. I'm not quite sure why, but part of their justification was that he was in ill health and it was near the end of his sentence. And so that's kind of the story behind the pardon.
So the Potter's house, would that be where the Moffats live? Nobody knows? You said behind the hedges?
I don't know who lives there now.
Oh, so it's not.
When I came to this, I wondered if it had anything to do with the body that was found in the well at that house that still exists at Taft's Corners. Do you know about that?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
That's another hunt for you.
That's my next book.
That White House is right there on the corner of Taft's Corners, an old farmhouse, I guess. And there's a story about a body that was dumped down the well. So when you started with this, I wondered if it was going there.
No connection that I know. But there's stories everywhere. Any other questions? This is just like scratching the surface of their story. I have a whole book about this, so you're interested in true crime and or Williston history, talk to me.
Was that Esther Urie's house in later years, the Potters, the brick one?
No, she
Am I-
lived right there in Williston
Oh, okay,
Village,
okay.
right next to the church.
Okay,
It's my grandfather's house before hers.
thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for taking the time.